The richest man in Chicago was crying on the courthouse steps, and no one dared to ask why. The only person brave enough to walk up to him was a barefoot 10-year-old girl who hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. December wind sliced through downtown at 30 miles per hour, rattling the glass towers that carried Daniel Whitmore's name in polished steel letters 3 stories high, but he barely felt the cold. He sat on the granite steps in a tailored black overcoat worth more than most people's monthly rent, staring at nothing as traffic hummed along Michigan Avenue, and cameras waited across the street for a statement he refused to give. Just hours earlier, he had stood beneath cathedral ceilings and buried the only person who had ever known him before the money, before the headlines, before the billion-dollar tech empire. And now the silence after the funeral pressed against his chest, heavier than the winter air. Across the plaza, Lily Harper adjusted the thin strap of a canvas bag that held 6 small bouquets wrapped in grocery store paper, each bundle of carnations selling for $5 to tourists who rarely looked down long enough to see her face. Her sneakers had split at the soles weeks ago, so she walked carefully over the frozen concrete counting coins in her pocket. 2 quarters, 3 dimes, and a single penny, trying to decide whether she could afford a cup of hot chocolate from the cart on the corner. When she noticed the man in the expensive coat bowing his head like someone who had lost more than a business deal, she didn't see a billionaire. She saw a grown-up who looked lonelier than she felt sleeping under the church awning 3 blocks away. Clutching the smallest bouquet, Lily crossed the wide stretch of pavement toward him, unaware that this quiet decision would change both of their lives forever. Lily stopped 3 feet away from him, close enough to see that his hands were trembling slightly against the dark wool of his coat, close enough to notice that his eyes were not red from the wind, but from something deeper and heavier. She cleared her throat the way her mother used to before speaking to strangers, and held out the smallest bouquet, white carnations with edges beginning to curl from the cold, and said in a steady voice that did not match her thin frame, "Mister, you look like you need these more than I do." Daniel lifted his head slowly, as if the effort required permission, and for a second, he simply stared at her, confused by the contrast of her fragile figure standing against the polished stone entrance of the courthouse, where he had just finalized estate documents worth hundreds of millions of dollars. No one had approached him all morning except lawyers and reporters, and now a child with wind-tangled hair and a coat 2 sizes too big was offering him something for free. "I do not have any cash on me," he replied automatically. The habit of transactions ingrained into every interaction, but Lily shook her head and pushed the flowers closer to his chest, saying, "They are not for sale today. They are just so you do not feel alone." The words struck him harder than any headline ever had, because loneliness was the one truth he could not hide behind wealth or influence. He hesitated before accepting the bouquet, his fingers brushing hers for a brief moment, and an unfamiliar warmth spread through him, despite the 28-degree air. Across the street, a black sedan idled, waiting to escort him back to the glass tower that bore his name. Yet for the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore did not stand up immediately, because the little girl in front of him had just offered him something no boardroom ever could. Daniel studied the small bouquet in his hands, as if it were made of something rare and fragile, not grocery store carnations wrapped in thin paper. And when he looked back at the girl, he noticed details he had missed before: the faint freckles across her pale cheeks, the determined set of her jaw, the way she stood straight despite the cold pressing through her worn coat. "What is your name?" he asked quietly, his voice rough from hours of silence, and she answered Lily Harper with a simple nod, as though her name did not carry the weight of sleeping beneath a church awning 3 blocks away, or counting coins for a cup of hot chocolate she probably would not buy. Harper, he repeated under his breath, the sound of it brushing against a memory he could not immediately place. But before he could follow the thought, a gust of wind swept across the plaza, and Lily instinctively hugged her canvas bag closer to her chest, protecting the last 5 bouquets like they were treasure. "You should go somewhere warm," Daniel said, glancing toward the revolving doors of the courthouse lobby where heat and polished marble waited. Yet Lily shook her head with a small smile and replied that she had to sell the rest before sunset, because people felt kinder before Christmas, and she wanted enough money for a bus ticket to the North Side shelter. The black sedan across the street honked softly, a reminder that schedules and obligations did not pause for unexpected moments. But Daniel did not move. Instead, he found himself asking how old she was and whether she had anyone looking after her, and Lily answered that she was 10 and that her father was supposed to come back a long time ago, though she guessed he must have gotten lost. The simplicity of her words settled into Daniel's chest like a stone, because for reasons he could not explain, the idea of a father who never returned suddenly felt personal. The name echoed in Daniel's mind long after Lily said it. Harper, the syllables pulling at a memory he had buried beneath quarterly reports and investor calls, and for a fleeting second, he saw a younger version of himself standing on a sunlit pier in Michigan nearly 11 years ago, beside a woman with the same last name and the same pale eyes as the girl in front of him. He blinked hard, pushing the image away because it felt impossible, because life did not circle back like that, not for men who had traded tenderness for ambition. Lily shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the concrete seeping cold through the thin rubber of her broken sneakers, and Daniel noticed that her hands were red from the wind. Small fingers wrapped around paper stems as if they were the only steady thing in her world. "You said your father was supposed to come back?" he asked carefully, lowering his voice as if the city noise might overhear, and Lily nodded with quiet certainty, explaining that her mother used to say he was smart and busy, and that sometimes important men forgot directions but always found their way home eventually. The words struck him with unsettling precision, because once upon a time someone had called him smart and busy too, and he had believed that chasing success was the same as building a future. The sedan's engine revved again, more impatient now. Yet Daniel ignored it, and instead removed his leather gloves, offering them to Lily without fully understanding why, telling her that Chicago winters were not forgiving, and that no 10-year-old should face 28-degree air alone. She hesitated, pride flickering in her eyes, but when another gust whipped through the plaza, she accepted them with a soft thank you that carried more grace than most executives he knew. As she slid her small hands into gloves far too large, Daniel felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with a question forming beneath the surface, a question he was suddenly afraid to ask, yet unable to silence. Daniel swallowed the question that threatened to surface, and instead asked something safer. "Where is your mother now?" And Lily's expression softened in a way that felt older than her 10 years, as she explained that her mother had gotten sick last spring, and that the hospital bills were too much, even after they sold their old car and most of their furniture. So now it was just her and the flowers and the promise that her father would come back one day. The plaza suddenly felt too wide, too exposed, as if the skyscrapers surrounding them were listening to every word, and Daniel felt an unfamiliar pull between stepping into his waiting car and staying exactly where he was. He told himself that this was not his responsibility, that cities were filled with stories like this, that generosity could be handled through foundations and tax deductions. Yet the sight of his oversized gloves swallowing her small hands refused to let him detach. "How long have you been on your own?" he asked quietly, and Lily answered that she had been staying near St. Matthew's Church for 3 months, because the pastor let her sleep under the side awning when the temperature dropped below 30 degrees, and she tried to sell at least 5 bouquets a day so she could afford meals and save for that bus ticket north. The practicality of her plan, measured in dollars and degrees, unsettled him more than tears ever could. A group of suited associates finally approached from across the street, their polished shoes clicking against concrete. One of them calling his name with cautious urgency, reminding him that the board meeting was already delayed by 40 minutes. Daniel did not turn immediately, because Lily was explaining that she liked white carnations best, since they reminded her of winter clouds before snow. And for reasons he could not explain, the way she described the sky made him feel as though he was standing at the edge of something irreversible. One of the associates stepped closer, lowering his voice to a professional whisper, as he reminded Daniel that investors were waiting on the 40th floor, and that the press had already begun speculating about his absence. But Daniel barely registered the words, because Lily was describing how she counted church bells at night to keep from feeling afraid, explaining that if she reached 12 chimes, she knew another hour had passed, and she was still safe. Something inside him shifted at the calm logic of a child, measuring security in bell tones instead of bedtime stories. He finally turned to his associates and told them he would arrive in 15 minutes, his tone firm enough to silence further protest. And when they retreated toward the sedan with visible confusion, he faced Lily again, as if the entire skyline had narrowed to the space between them. "Do you go to school?" he asked gently. Aware that the question carried weight, and she admitted that she used to attend a public elementary school on the west side until her mother could no longer afford supplies and transportation, but she still kept a small notebook in her bag where she practiced spelling words she remembered from 4th grade. She even recited one for him, now Perseverance, carefully sounding out each syllable as though presenting proof that she had not given up. The word settled heavily between them. Daniel glanced toward the towering building that bore his last name in silver letters 30 feet tall, and realized that perseverance had once been his favorite word too, back when it meant building something great instead of surviving something cold. A light snow began to drift down, thin flakes catching in Lily's hair and on the shoulders of his overcoat. And without fully thinking through the consequences, Daniel asked if she would allow him to buy the rest of her bouquets so she could at least spend the afternoon somewhere warm. Lily hesitated, pride and caution flickering in her pale eyes, and in that pause he felt the fragile tension of a decision that could either remain a passing kindness or become the beginning of something neither of them yet understood. Lily tightened her grip on the paper-wrapped stems as the snow gathered lightly on her shoulders, and for a moment she looked far older than 10, measuring the offer not in dollars but in risk. She had learned quickly that kindness from strangers sometimes came with expectations, so she lifted her chin and asked how much he was planning to pay, her voice steady even as her fingers trembled inside gloves that were still too large. Daniel understood the unspoken test and answered plainly that he would pay whatever she normally earned in a full afternoon, and then some, because no child should have to calculate survival in $5 increments. He reached into his coat and removed his wallet, pulling out several crisp $100 bills, careful not to make a show of it, and handed them to her folded discreetly inside the bouquet wrapping, so no one passing by would stare. Lily blinked at the weight of the paper in her hand, clearly unused to holding that much money at once, and she began counting carefully, lips moving silently as she verified the total because trust for her required proof. Before she could respond, a uniformed building security guard approached from the courthouse entrance. His expression firm as he informed Lily that solicitation was not allowed near the property and that she needed to move along immediately. The words were not cruel, only procedural, but they sliced through the fragile warmth that had formed between them. Daniel stood to his full height, nearly a foot taller than the guard, and calmly stated that the transaction was complete and that the girl was his guest for the moment, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The guard hesitated, recognizing him instantly, and after a stiff nod, he stepped back toward the revolving doors. Lily looked up at Daniel with a mixture of relief and uncertainty, snowflakes melting against her pale lashes, and asked softly if buying her flowers meant she had to leave anyway, because she did not want to cause trouble. Daniel shook his head and said that sometimes leaving one place was the first step toward finding a better one. And as the snow began to fall more steadily, he realized this was no longer just about bouquets or warmth. It was about a responsibility he was beginning to feel, but had not yet dared to name. The snow thickened from a gentle drift to a steady curtain of white, softening the sharp edges of the courthouse steps and blurring the towering skyline behind them, and Lily glanced toward the street where buses roared past in slow, slush-covered lanes, clearly calculating whether she should return to the familiar shelter of St. Matthew's or trust the stranger who had just changed her entire afternoon. Daniel sensed the hesitation and crouched slightly so that his eyes met hers at level height. explaining that there was a cafe inside the building lobby open to the public and that he would simply like to buy her a warm meal, nothing more, because 28-degree weather was not meant for children counting church bells alone. Lily studied his face with surprising focus, as if searching for something beyond polished shoes and a tailored coat. And after a long pause, she nodded once and said that she would stay only until the snow slowed down because she did not want the pastor to worry if she did not return by dark. Daniel agreed without argument and extended his hand not to pull her, but to offer balance on the slick granite steps, and when she placed her small gloved fingers in his, the contact felt less like charity and more like a fragile agreement between two people who had both lost something important. Together they walked toward the revolving doors, the warmth of the lobby spilling out in golden light against the gray afternoon, and inside the marble floors gleamed under chandeliers that hung nearly 20 feet overhead. Lily's footsteps echoed softly as she crossed into a world that smelled of espresso and polished wood instead of snow and exhaust. And Daniel noticed the way her eyes widened not with greed, but with quiet wonder. At a corner table near the tall glass windows, he ordered hot chocolate topped with whipped cream and a turkey sandwich with soup. And as the steam rose between them, Lily removed his oversized gloves carefully and placed them on the table like something borrowed that she intended to return, unaware that with every cautious gesture she was reshaping a man who had believed his life was already fully defined. Steam curled upward from the ceramic cup as Lily wrapped both hands around it, absorbing the heat slowly, as if she did not trust warmth to last. And Daniel watched the way she waited for permission before taking her first sip, a habit formed from too many doors that had closed too quickly. When she finally tasted the hot chocolate, a faint smile touched her lips, subtle but genuine, and she thanked him, with a softness that felt more sincere than any gratitude he had ever received at a charity gala. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, snow continued to layer the city in quiet white, muting traffic and softening the usual urgency of downtown Chicago. And for a brief moment, the world inside the cafe felt suspended from everything else. Daniel asked her about the notebook she mentioned earlier, and Lily eagerly pulled it from her canvas bag, revealing pages filled with careful handwriting and multiplication tables written in pencil. Some numbers erased and rewritten until they were nearly smudged through. She explained that she practiced every night under the church awning, using the street lamp for light, because she wanted to be a teacher one day and believed teachers had to know more words than anyone else. The simplicity of her dream tightened something in Daniel's chest that success had never reached. As she ate slowly, saving half of the sandwich in a napkin for later, he noticed a thin silver chain resting against her collarbone, partially hidden beneath the oversized coat. When she leaned forward to reach for her soup, the pendant slipped into view, a small oval locket, engraved with two faint initials that stopped his breath entirely. D and W. The letters were worn but unmistakable. His pulse began to pound in his ears, louder than the muted jazz playing overhead, because 11 years ago he had given an identical locket to a woman named Sarah Harper on a pier by Lake Michigan, promising that distance would never separate them for long. He forced his voice to remain steady and asked Lily where she got the necklace, and she answered that it belonged to her mother, and that she was told it was from her father, though she did not remember his face clearly since he left before she turned 1. Daniel's fingers tightened around the untouched coffee in front of him, the porcelain suddenly fragile in his grasp, as realization crept in with terrifying precision that this meeting might not be coincidence at all, and for the first time in years, the future he had carefully constructed began to feel dangerously incomplete. Daniel forced himself to breathe slowly, keeping his expression composed, even as the engraved letters on the small silver locket seemed to burn into his memory, because 11 years ago he had stood beneath a summer sky along Lake Michigan and fastened that very necklace around Sarah Harper's neck, promising that once his company stabilized, he would return and build a life that did not revolve around airports and investor calls. Instead, he had chosen expansion over presence, opportunity over commitment, convincing himself that success would excuse the distance, and when her messages gradually stopped, he had accepted the silence as mutual closure rather than searching for answers he was afraid to face. Now seated across from a 10-year-old girl who shared Sarah's last name and pale eyes, the past no longer felt distant or negotiable. He asked gently how old she had been when her father left, and Lily stirred her soup thoughtfully before replying that her mother said he went away for work before she could remember his voice, and that sometimes she imagined he was building something important, so he could come back proud. Daniel's throat tightened at the innocence of that belief. Outside the window, snow continued to blanket the sidewalks in several inches of white, muting the horns and sirens of the city, as if Chicago itself were holding its breath. He asked if she still had any photographs of her parents together, and Lily nodded, explaining that there was one picture folded inside her notebook, taken near the water with tall buildings behind them. She carefully retrieved it and slid it across the polished cafe table. The image struck him like a silent confession. There he was, younger, thinner, wearing a navy jacket, and an uncertain smile, his arm around Sarah as wind lifted her hair. He recognized the pier, instantly remembered the scent of lake air and the promise he had made to call the following week. The date in the corner confirmed everything. His pulse pounded as realization settled into place with terrifying clarity. Lily watched him study the photograph and asked softly if he thought her father looked like someone important, because her mother used to say he would be famous one day. Daniel set the picture down carefully, aware that the truth hovering between them could alter both of their lives forever, and for the first time since entering the cafe, he felt less like a powerful executive and more like a man standing on the edge of a decision that would demand far more courage than any boardroom ever had. Daniel kept his gaze on the photograph longer than necessary, committing every detail to memory, as if confirming a truth he had tried to outrun for more than a decade. And when he finally lifted his eyes to Lily, he felt the full weight of the silence between them. She mistook his pause for admiration and offered a small, hopeful smile, explaining that her mother always said the man in the picture was going to change the world one day, and that maybe when he finished changing it, he would remember to come back for them. The words landed with devastating precision. Daniel's reflection faintly appeared in the cafe window behind her, layered over the snowy cityscape, and for a moment, he saw both versions of himself at once, the ambitious young entrepreneur who believed love could wait, and the powerful executive who now realized that time had not waited for him. He asked quietly when her mother passed away, and Lily answered that it was in early April, just as the last patches of snow were melting, and that she held her hand the entire night in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and rain. She said it calmly, as though grief had already been folded into survival. Daniel felt a sharp ache in his chest, not only for Sarah, but for the nights he had never been there to witness, for the hospital bills she mentioned, for the empty chair beside a child who still believed her father was simply delayed. He asked if anyone else knew about her situation, any relatives, neighbors, teachers, and Lily shook her head gently, explaining that most people assumed her father would come eventually because her mother never spoke badly about him, and that she preferred to believe he had a good reason for staying away. The innocence of that loyalty felt almost unbearable. Snow continued to gather outside, now several inches thick along the curb, and Daniel understood that the storm forming inside him could no longer be ignored. He folded the photograph carefully and handed it back, his voice steady but quieter than before, as he told Lily that sometimes grown men made choices they regretted, and that sometimes finding the right road back required more courage than leaving in the first place. She listened with curious eyes, unaware that every word he spoke was slowly turning inward, reshaping a future he had not yet dared to confess. The cafe grew quieter as the afternoon crowd thinned the storm outside, discouraging foot traffic, and Daniel realized that the board meeting he had postponed was now nearly an hour behind schedule. Yet the urgency that once defined him felt distant compared to the fragile truth sitting across the table. Lily carefully folded the photograph back into her notebook and finished the last spoonful of soup, saving the final bite of her sandwich in a napkin with deliberate care, explaining that dinner at the shelter was never guaranteed if too many people arrived before dark. Daniel watched her movements closely, each small act of preparation reinforcing the reality of how long she had managed alone. He reached for his phone, stepping slightly aside from the table, and sent a brief message to his chief of staff, instructing her to handle the meeting without him and to clear his schedule for the evening. Then he called a private investigative contact he had used years ago for corporate matters. His voice low but steady as he requested a confidential background check on Sarah Harper and any records connected to her medical history and next of kin. When he ended the call, the weight of what he had set in motion settled heavily in his chest. Returning to the table, he asked Lily if she would allow him to drive her to the shelter once the snow eased, explaining that it was safer than walking several blocks in accumulating ice, and she studied him carefully before agreeing, reminding him that she needed to be back before the church doors closed at 8 o'clock sharp. Daniel nodded, promising he would not break that rule. Outside, snow had piled high enough to cover the street markings, and the world beyond the window appeared softened and almost unreal, as though time itself had slowed to grant him one final chance to face the past. He understood that if the investigation confirmed what his instincts already knew, there would be no returning to the life he had carefully compartmentalized, because the possibility that Lily was not just a child in need, but his own daughter, demanded more than charity. It demanded accountability, and for the first time in 11 years, Daniel Whitmore felt both the fear and the fragile hope of a man standing on the threshold of redemption. The call came sooner than he expected. Daniel had just settled the bill and helped Lily into the back seat of the sedan, instructing the driver to proceed slowly through the thickening snow toward St. Matthew's Church, when his phone vibrated with the private number he rarely saw flash across his screen. He answered with controlled calm, but the voice on the other end did not waste time with pleasantries. Records confirmed that Sarah Harper had listed no spouse at the time of her hospital admission. Yet under emergency contact, there was an unsent draft form bearing his full name, Daniel Whitmore, saved, but never submitted. And more than that, medical archives showed that Lily Harper's birth certificate had left the father line blank, despite a pending paternity test that was never completed. Daniel's breath slowed, each word landing with quiet devastation. The investigator continued explaining that archived hospital billing statements and old residential addresses matched the timeline of his relationship with Sarah 11 years earlier, and that there was no evidence of any other long-term partner during that period. Probability, the voice said carefully, was extremely high. Daniel ended the call without another word, his hand remaining motionless around the phone as snow streaked across the tinted window beside him. In the back seat, Lily watched the city blur by her forehead, resting lightly against the glass as she traced invisible shapes in the condensation, unaware that the man seated inches away was confronting the collapse of every excuse he had carried for more than a decade. He remembered the day he left Chicago for a 6-month expansion in California, promising Sarah he would return before autumn, then extending the contract twice, then choosing silence when ambition demanded undivided focus. He had told himself she deserved someone more stable, someone not consumed by risk. And in doing so, he had relinquished responsibility without ever confirming the consequences. Now those consequences were breathing softly beside him, humming a tune her mother used to sing, clutching a napkin-wrapped half-sandwich as though it were treasure. The sedan turned onto the narrow street leading to the church, tires crunching over several inches of fresh snow, and Daniel understood with terrifying clarity that this was no longer about possibility, but about truth. Lily was not simply a child he had encountered on a winter afternoon. She was his daughter, and for the first time in his life, Daniel Whitmore felt the full, undeniable weight of what it meant to have failed someone who had waited for him without ever knowing his name. The sedan came to a slow stop in front of St. Matthew's Church, its brick walls softened by the heavy snowfall and the yellow glow of exterior lamps casting long reflections across the white-covered sidewalk. And Daniel remained still for a moment, his hand resting on the door handle, as the reality of what he had just learned pressed against his ribs with relentless force. Beside him, Lily gathered her small bag and looked toward the familiar awning with quiet relief, unaware that the world she was stepping into was about to shift in ways neither of them had prepared for. Daniel stepped out first, the cold air cutting through his coat, and walked around to open her door, offering his hand again, as she climbed down carefully to avoid slipping on the ice. The church bell rang 6 times, echoing through the snow-muffled evening, and Lily smiled faintly, explaining that she still had 2 hours before the doors closed, which meant she could help set up folding chairs inside if the pastor needed volunteers. Daniel knelt slightly so that he was at her eye level, his breath visible in the freezing air, and for a long second he searched her face for traces of Sarah, finding them in the curve of her smile and the steadiness of her gaze. Lily noticed his silence and asked if he was worried about something, her voice gentle despite the exhaustion lining her small frame. He felt the words building in his throat, heavy and irreversible, and he understood that delaying them any longer would only repeat the same mistake he had made 11 years ago. Snow settled across his shoulders as he spoke carefully, telling her that sometimes fathers did not leave because they did not care, but because they were afraid of failing the people they loved, and that fear could make them disappear instead of staying to fix what they should have protected. Lily listened quietly, confusion flickering across her pale eyes as she tried to follow the meaning behind his tone. Daniel's voice trembled for the first time in years as he admitted that he had once known her mother, that he had been young and ambitious and foolish, and that he had walked away without knowing she was carrying something far more important than a memory. The air between them felt suspended fragile as falling snow, and when he finally said the words, "I believe I am your father," the world seemed to narrow to the space of a single heartbeat, waiting for a child who had spent her life imagining a return to decide whether this man standing before her was the answer to a promise she had never stopped believing. For a moment, Lily did not move, the snow collecting quietly on her thin shoulders, as if the world itself had paused to hear her answer. And Daniel saw the fragile calculations forming behind her pale eyes, 10 years of waiting compressed into a single breath. She searched his face the way she had earlier in the cafe, not for wealth or authority, but for truth, and when she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than before, asking how he could be sure. Daniel swallowed hard and explained that he had spoken to someone who confirmed the timeline, that he recognized the locket because he had given it to her mother on a summer evening by the lake, and that the photograph she carried had been taken the day he promised to return. His words came slowly, stripped of pride, leaving only regret exposed in the freezing air. Lily's gaze dropped to the silver pendant resting against her coat, her fingers tracing the engraved letters as if they might rearrange themselves into certainty, and she admitted that her mother never said her father's name out loud, only that he was building something big, and that one day he would understand what truly mattered. Tears gathered in Daniel's eyes, not dramatic or loud, but steady and undeniable, because he had built towers of glass and steel while missing the one foundation that counted. He told her he had been afraid of failing, afraid that he could not provide stability while chasing ambition, and that instead of staying and trying, he had chosen distance, a choice he would regret for the rest of his life. Lily looked up again, and in her expression there was confusion, hurt, and something even more powerful than either of those, a cautious hope. She asked if he had known about her, and when he answered no, that he had not known, and that ignorance did not excuse absence. The honesty seemed to settle between them like a fragile bridge. The church door opened behind her as warm light spilled onto the snow, and Daniel realized this was the moment that would define every year that followed. Lily took a slow step closer, her small voice barely rising above the winter wind, as she said that she had always imagined her father taller than everyone else, but she had also imagined he would feel sorry for being late. Daniel's breath caught as she studied him one last time, and when she whispered that she wanted proof, not just with papers, but with actions, he nodded without hesitation, understanding that redemption would not be granted by words alone, but earned in the quiet, ordinary days ahead. Daniel did not reach for her, immediately understanding that trust could not be taken the way he had once taken time for granted. So instead, he stood in the falling snow and made a promise that carried no grand speeches, only steady intention. He told Lily that the very first proof would be simple, that he would not disappear tonight, that he would walk her inside, speak with the pastor openly, and return tomorrow morning before school hours to begin fixing what he had neglected, one responsible step at a time. Lily searched his face again, measuring sincerity the way she measured bus fare and church bells, and after a long, quiet moment, she nodded once and extended her hand, not as a child asking to be rescued, but as someone willing to test whether a man could keep his word. Together they stepped toward the church doors, the warmth inside wrapping around them as snow continued to fall beyond the threshold. The scent of old wood and candle wax filled the air, and a few volunteers glanced up with mild surprise at the sight of a well-dressed executive entering beside the girl who usually slipped in quietly before closing time. Daniel introduced himself without mentioning wealth or position, only stating that he was Lily's father and that he intended to confirm everything legally and responsibly, as soon as possible, his voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. The pastor, a gray-haired man with kind but cautious eyes, listened carefully and explained that Lily had been respectful and hard-working, helping stack chairs and wipe down tables, and that any change in her living situation would require proper documentation to ensure her safety. Daniel agreed immediately, welcoming every safeguard, because this time he would not cut corners or rush through obligations. He arranged for a private family attorney to initiate formal paternity testing first thing in the morning and requested that temporary accommodation be provided in a nearby hotel suite, approved by the church, until the results were finalized, ensuring Lily would remain under supervision and within clear guidelines. As Lily placed her canvas bag on a folding chair and removed the oversized gloves to hand them back, Daniel gently closed her fingers around them and told her to keep them, explaining that fathers were supposed to notice when their daughters were cold. For the first time since the snow began to fall, a genuine warmth spread through the room that had nothing to do with temperature, because redemption had shifted from possibility into action. And Daniel understood that every sunrise from this night forward would measure him not by his fortune, but by whether he showed up. Morning arrived with a pale winter sun reflecting off nearly 6 inches of snow, turning the city streets into a field of white light. And true to his word, Daniel stood outside St. Matthew's Church at 7:30, sharp coat buttoned, breath steady, carrying a small paper bag from a local bakery that still smelled of warm cinnamon and fresh bread. Inside, Lily was finishing a cup of oatmeal at a folding table when the pastor informed her that someone was waiting, and for a split second, fear flickered across her face before she recognized the familiar silhouette through the frosted glass door. Daniel did not wave dramatically or call her name loudly. He simply remained there, present. And when she stepped outside, he greeted her with a soft good morning and handed her the bag, explaining that breakfast should include something sweet, at least once in a while. Lily peeked inside and smiled shyly at the sight of a large cinnamon roll dusted with powdered sugar, and the small curve of her lips felt like a victory greater than any acquisition he had ever closed. A black sedan waited at the curb, but this time Daniel opened the rear door and allowed Lily to choose her seat first, making it clear that nothing about the day would be forced. They drove to a reputable medical clinic downtown, where arrangements had already been made for expedited paternity testing, conducted under full legal supervision, and Daniel answered every form, honestly signing his name without hesitation beneath declarations of responsibility that once would have intimidated him more than any contract. Lily watched the process quietly, her small hand resting on the silver locket as if drawing courage from its cool surface. And when the nurse explained that results would take several days despite expedited processing, Daniel nodded, accepting that even redemption required patience. Afterward, he took her to a modest hotel suite approved by the church, not extravagant but warm and safe, and arranged for a child advocate recommended by the pastor to ensure every step followed proper guidelines. He then sat across from Lily at the small table by the window and asked about her favorite subjects in school, listening carefully as she described multiplication tables and spelling words with the seriousness of someone who understood opportunity was fragile. By noon, he had postponed 2 board meetings and delegated control of a major acquisition because for the first time, the measure of his success was not printed in financial reports, but reflected in the cautious trust slowly forming in his daughter's eyes. 3 days later, the call finally came, and Daniel placed it on speaker inside the quiet hotel suite, so there would be no secrecy between them. His hand resting flat against the table, as the licensed physician confirmed what his heart had already accepted, that the probability of paternity was greater than 99.9%. The room seemed to exhale all at once, and Lily looked from the phone to Daniel, as if waiting for the world to explain itself in simple words. He knelt beside her chair so their eyes were level, and told her gently that the test meant he was her father in every legal and biological way, but more importantly, he wanted to be her father in the ways that mattered daily, showing up to school meetings, helping with homework, listening when she was afraid. Lily studied him carefully, then asked if being her father meant he would still have to travel all the time, and Daniel answered honestly that he would travel less because some priorities had changed forever. That same afternoon, he met with his executive team through a video conference, announcing that he was restructuring his schedule indefinitely and appointing a co-chief executive officer to manage operations during his reduced hours, a decision that shocked shareholders, but signaled publicly that his life was no longer centered solely on expansion. He then returned to St. Matthew's Church to thank the pastor and formally establish a foundation in Sarah Harper's name, dedicated to assisting single parents with medical expenses and housing support, ensuring that no child would have to count church bells to measure safety again. The pastor accepted with quiet approval, reminding him that generosity must remain consistent long after headlines fade. Within a week, Lily was enrolled in a nearby elementary school with proper documentation, new winter boots, and a backpack. She chose herself in a soft shade of blue, yet Daniel made certain that nothing felt like charity-only transition. Each evening, he reviewed spelling words with her at the small dining table of a rented townhouse he selected, intentionally modest, compared to his estate, wanting their first home together to feel lived in rather than displayed. As Lily carefully wrote perseverance across lined paper, Daniel realized that redemption was not a single grand gesture, but a series of ordinary promises kept, and for the first time in many years, the future no longer felt like a race to outrun regret, but a steady path he was finally willing to walk at her side. By early spring, the snow had melted into narrow streams along the sidewalks, and the townhouse windows stood open to a softer breeze that carried the scent of rain instead of ice. Lily now walked to school each morning in sturdy boots with her blue backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders, and Daniel made it a habit to stand at the door and watch until she reached the corner. Not out of fear, but out of gratitude for a routine he once would have considered ordinary. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered across the living room floor in warm gold rectangles, Lily sat cross-legged with her notebook open and practiced reading aloud. While Daniel prepared dinner in the kitchen, deliberately simple meals he insisted on learning himself, rather than delegating to staff. Halfway through a paragraph, she paused, looked up at him and said the word "Dad" for the first time without hesitation. The sound of it settled into the room like something sacred and steady, and Daniel turned slowly, absorbing the weight and grace of a title he had nearly forfeited forever. He did not respond with grand emotion or overwhelming promises. He simply smiled and asked her to read the sentence again, because being her father now meant consistency more than spectacle. Later that evening, they placed a small framed photograph of Sarah on the hallway table, surrounded by fresh white carnations Lily had chosen from a neighborhood market. And together, they stood quietly for a moment of remembrance that felt less like sorrow and more like continuity. In the quiet hum of the house, Daniel understood that while he could never reclaim the lost years, he could honor them by building something gentler in their place, a life measured not in headlines or earnings, but in the steady rhythm of showing up day after day. In late May, the elementary school auditorium filled with folding chairs and the restless energy of parents holding phones ready to record, and Daniel sat in the third row wearing a simple navy blazer instead of a tailored suit. His attention fixed entirely on the small stage where Lily waited behind a curtain, clutching a stack of index cards. Weeks earlier, she had been chosen to deliver a short speech about perseverance at the spring assembly, and every evening they had practiced together at the kitchen table, her voice growing steadier with each repetition. When her name was announced, she stepped into the bright overhead lights without flinching blue backpack, now replaced by a neat white dress and carefully brushed hair. And Daniel felt his pulse quicken, not with anxiety, but with awe. She began by explaining that perseverance meant continuing even when something feels impossible, and as she spoke, her gaze found him in the audience, anchoring her words in the certainty that he would be there when she finished. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, yet what moved Daniel most was not the volume, but the confidence in her posture. The way she no longer measured safety in church bells or bus fare, but in the presence of someone who showed up. After the ceremony, she ran toward him slightly breathless and asked if he had heard every word, and he answered honestly that he had not missed a single one. Together, they walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight, passing families clustered in celebration. And Daniel understood that while he once believed success was defined by expansion and recognition, the truest measure of his life now stood beside him, holding index cards and smiling without fear, proof that the most important commitments are not announced on stages, but lived quietly in the spaces between them. On the first anniversary of the day, snow had covered the courthouse steps. Daniel stood in his office overlooking downtown Chicago as early winter light reflected against the glass towers, and on his desk rested a small vase of fresh white carnations that Lily had placed there before school that morning. She now visited the building occasionally, not as a child selling flowers on the sidewalk, but as a daughter proud to see her father's name on the skyline. And yet Daniel understood that the true transformation had not occurred in steel or stock prices, but in the quiet routines that shaped their home. That evening, they walked together along the same stretch of Michigan Avenue, where they had first met, the air crisp at 32 degrees, but no longer biting with loneliness. And Lily slipped her gloved hand into his without hesitation. She pointed toward the courthouse steps and said she remembered how he looked that day, sad and lost, and Daniel admitted that he had been mourning more than he realized, because he had not yet understood what he had nearly missed. They paused beneath the streetlights as gentle snow began to fall again, softer than before, and Lily handed him a single carnation, wrapped in simple paper, explaining that sometimes the smallest gifts change everything. Daniel accepted it with a smile that carried gratitude rather than regret, knowing that redemption had not erased the past, but had given it meaning. As they turned toward home, their footsteps aligned across the thin layer of snow, and Daniel felt the steady warmth of her presence beside him, a reminder that while wealth can build empires, it is love that rebuilds a life. And in the quiet glow of the city, he understood that the greatest return on any investment is the chance to show up again and again for the person who once waited without knowing your name. Did this story leave a lasting impression on you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, rate it from 1 to 10, and tap the end screen to see another heartwarming story waiting for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you don't miss any new stories. Until our next story.